The bodies arrived on the shore for 3 days. They came in clusters, some washed up whole, others in pieces. The tide carried them gently, as if the sea itself had tired of violence. Fishermen along the northern coast of Kyushu pulled samurai helmets from the surf. Children found Mongol boots tangled in seaweed. The water between the islands ran dark with more than salt. When the counting finally stopped, scribes recorded numbers that seemed impossible. 20,000, 30,000. Some chronicles claimed more. The Hachiman Gudokun, written decades later, would describe the sea itself turning against the invaders. But before the divine wind came, before the typhoon that would be named Kamikaze, there had been days of something else entirely. Days when men discovered what they were capable of doing to other men. The Battle of Tsushima in 1274 was not the largest engagement of the Mongol invasions of Japan. It was not the final confrontation. It did not decide the war. But it was the place where two utterly incompatible understandings of warfare collided with such force that the ethical frameworks of both sides shattered. What remained was not strategy or honor or divine providence. What remained was the thing that lives underneath civilization when civilization tears. This is the story of that tearing. The Mongol Empire in 1274 stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. It was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Within its borders lived perhaps 100 million people speaking hundreds of languages, practicing dozens of religions, governed by a single administrative system of terrifying efficiency. The Mongols had conquered the Jin dynasty. They had broken the Khwarezmian Empire. They had burned Baghdad and depopulated entire regions of Eastern Europe. They did not lose wars. Their military doctrine was perfection itself. It was built on mobility, discipline, and psychological warfare refined over generations. Mongol armies moved faster than their enemies thought possible. They communicated across vast distances using relay systems. They incorporated conquered peoples into their ranks, absorbing the best military technologies of each civilization they destroyed. Chinese siege engineers, Persian administrators, Korean shipwrights, and they had a philosophy about resistance. The Mongol approach to conquest was binary. Cities that surrendered were taxed but preserved. Cities that resisted were annihilated so completely that the memory of annihilation prevent future resistance elsewhere. After the siege of Merv in 1221, Mongol soldiers reportedly spent 13 days killing every living thing in the city. Contemporary sources claimed the dead numbered over 1 million. Whether or not that number was accurate mattered less than the fact that people believed it. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was cruelty as infrastructure. The Mongols understood that reputation reduced casualties. If your reputation was fearsome enough, cities would surrender before you arrived. Your army could move faster, needed less supply, suffered fewer losses. Terror was logistics. Terror was efficiency. The Yasa, the legal code attributed to Genghis Khan himself, mandated death for dozens of offenses but also guaranteed religious tolerance and safe passage for merchants. The Mongol peace was real for those who accepted it, but Japan had not accepted it. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis and founder of the Yuan dynasty, had sent envoys to Japan multiple times beginning in 1266. The letters were polite but clear. The Mongol Empire had unified most of the known world. Japan was isolated and small. Resistance was pointless. Tribute was expected. The Japanese had killed the envoys. This was not a hasty decision. The Kamakura shogunate, which ruled Japan in the name of a powerless emperor, had debated the Mongol letters extensively. Some advocated negotiation. Others warned that any acknowledgement of Mongol authority would undermine Japanese sovereignty. The final decision reflected both strategic calculation and cultural reality. Japan had never been conquered, ever. Not by the Chinese dynasties. Not by internal rivals who might have invited foreign assistance. The divine ancestry of the imperial line, the geographic isolation of the islands, the warrior culture of the samurai class, all of these combined into a conviction that Japan was fundamentally different from other nations. The term, land of the gods, was not mere poetry. It was constitutional fact. And so when Kublai Khan's envoys arrived with letters written in the style used for subordinate states, Japanese officials understood exactly what was being demanded. Not alliance, not trade, submission. The envoys were sent back, Then they were ignored. Then they were executed. Kublai Khan began preparing an invasion. The logistics were staggering. The Mongol Empire had conquered vast territories on horseback, but horses cannot cross oceans. The invasion of Japan required a fleet. Ships had to be built or commandeered across Korea and coast. China. Sailors had to be trained. Supplies had to be gathered. And an army had to be assembled that could fight effectively after weeks at sea. The force that gathered in Korean ports in late 1274 numbered between 20,000 and 40,000 men, depending on which chronicle you believe. It included Mongol cavalry commanders, Chinese infantry, Korean sailors, and Jurchen auxiliaries. It included siege weapons designed to reduce Japanese castles. It included interpreters who spoke Japanese and officials prepared to establish administrative control once resistance collapsed. It included men who had seen what happened to cities that resisted. The fleet sailed in November. The crossing from Korea to Japan is not long, barely 100 miles at the closest point, but winter seas in the Tsushima Strait are dangerous even for modern vessels. The invasion force traveled in hundreds of ships of varying quality. Many had been built hastily. Some were converted merchant vessels. The Korean shipwrights pressed into service had done their best, but their best was constrained by impossible deadlines and the demands of commanders who understood horses better than hulls. The first landfall was Tsushima Island. Tsushima sits almost exactly halfway between Korea and Japan, a narrow mountainous island about 40 miles long. In 1274 it was home to perhaps 20,000 people, mostly fishermen and farmers. It was governed by the So clan, a minor samurai family who owed allegiance to the Shoni clan in Kyushu. The island had strategic value far beyond its size. It was the gateway to Japan. Any invasion from the continent would encounter Tsushima first. The garrison numbered about 100 samurai, and perhaps twice that many auxiliary troops. They saw the Mongol fleet approaching on the morning of November 5th. Imagine standing on those beaches. You are a samurai. Your world is rigidly structured. You know your place within a hierarchy that stretches from your immediate lord through ascending ranks to the shogun himself, and ultimately to the emperor, whose divine ancestry validates the entire system. You have trained since childhood in mounted archery, swordsmanship, and a code of conduct that equates personal honor with cosmic order. You have fought in battles before. Japan's recent history has been turbulent. The Genpei War only decades ago saw samurai clans slaughtering each other with enthusiastic brutality. You have seen men die, you have killed men, but those were individual combats between warriors who understood the same rules. Now you see hundreds of ships. The Mongol landing was methodical. Advance units secured the beach while archers provided covering fire. Korean sailors managed the difficult work of bringing vessels close enough to shore to disembark horses. Chinese infantry formed defensive perimeters. The choreography was precise because it had been practiced dozens of times during the Mongol conquest of Korea itself. The Japanese attacked immediately. Samurai warfare in the 13th century was deeply ritualized. Before combat, warriors would announce their names and lineages. They would recount their ancestors' deeds. They would challenge worthy opponents to single combat. This was not mere arrogance, it was theological necessity. A samurai's honor was his soul made visible. To die anonymously was to be erased from meaning its elf. So Sukekuni, the commander of Tsushima's garrison, led a cavalry charge directly into the Mongol lines. The Mongols did not engage him individually, they did not announce their names, they deployed in coordinated units and used group archery tactics designed to kill horses. Samurai were expert archers themselves, but they were trained for accuracy in single combat. Mongol composite bows were designed for massed volleys. When hundreds of arrows fill the air simultaneously, horses die regardless of the rider's skill. So Sukekuni's horse went down in the first minutes. He fought on foot with his retainers around him. The Mongols surrounded the formation and continued shooting. When the Japanese were sufficiently wounded and exhausted, Mongol heavy cavalry charged through them. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 2 hours. Contemporary Japanese accounts describe the Mongol tactics with a kind of horrified confusion. The invaders used explosives, ceramic grenades filled with gunpowder that produced noise and shrapnel. They employed coordinated infantry movements that seemed to function without individual heroism. They targeted horses systematically. They did not respect challenges to single combat. Most disturbing of all, they did not fight like the enemy was human. When the beach was secured, the Mongols began processing prisoners. This is where the nature of what happened on Tsushima becomes difficult to reconstruct with precision. Japanese sources written decades later are propagandistic. They needed the Mongol invasion to be monstrous to justify the massive expenditure of resources on coastal defenses. Mongol and Chinese sources barely mention Tsushima at all. It was a minor action in a failed campaign, hardly worth detailed record. But certain facts appear in multiple independent sources. The Mongols separated prisoners into categories. Samurai officers were identified and isolated. Common soldiers were distinguished from civilians. Women and children were grouped separately. This was not random violence. This was administrative processing. The Mongol Empire had refined systems for incorporating conquered populations. Skilled craftsmen were valuable and would be relocated. Young men could be conscripted into auxiliary forces. Women and children could be enslaved or distributed as rewards. But these systems assumed eventual submission. Tsushima was not going to submit. The island was simply too small to hold permanently with the forces available. The invasion fleet needed to move on to the main islands of Japan. Tsushima was a waypoint, but leaving a hostile population in your rear during an invasion creates dangerous complications. Suppressed populations can rise. They can raid supply lines. They can encourage resistance elsewhere. The Mongol solution was elimination. Accounts in the Hachiman Gudokun describe survivors hiding in the mountains, reporting that the Mongols gathered civilians in groups and killed them. The methods varied: decapitation for speed, burning for those who hid in buildings. Some sources describe prisoners being tied together and drowned. Others mention crucifixion. The word used in several chronicles is naibon, internal separation. It suggests a systematic process. Modern historians debate these accounts. The numbers claimed seem impossibly high. Some chronicles say 10,000 civilians died. On an island the total population of 20,000. That would be demographic catastrophe beyond anything the Mongols usually inflicted on populations they intended to govern. It's more likely that several thousand died, and the horror of those deaths was multiplied in traumatized memory. But whether 3,000 or 10,000, the psychological impact was the same. The Mongols were not fighting a war, they were performing an execution. There is a particular horror in mass killing when it is conducted with bureaucratic calm. Rage is comprehensible, rage burns hot and burns out. But systematic murder requires emotional distance. It requires breaking the process into steps so that no single participant feels responsible for the whole. It requires organization, and organization leaves evidence. Japanese sources describe Mongol soldiers boring holes through the hands of captured samurai and threading rope through the wounds so prisoners could be tied together in lines. This is horrifying, but also practical. It prevents escape. It allows a few guards to control many prisoners. It's the kind of technique you develop through practice. The samurai code had no framework for this. Bushido, as it would later be formalized, did not quite exist yet in 1274, but the essential elements were already in place. A samurai's identity was inseparable from his capacity for violence undertaken honorably. You could kill or die. You could not be unmade. Being roped through your hands like livestock unmakes you. The Mongols understood this perfectly. They had fought warrior cultures before. They had defeated the Kipchak Turks, who had similar codes of mounted martial honor. They had crushed the Nizari Ismai, who preferred death to surrender. The Mongol approach to warrior elites was consistent: demonstrate that their code is worthless. Because if the code is worthless, resistance becomes meaningless. On Tsushima, Mongol commanders allowed atrocities that served this purpose. Samurai who demanded single combat were mocked and shot by multiple archers. Warriors who recited their lineages had their mouths stuffed with dirt. Women from samurai families were raped in front of their male relatives before those relatives were killed. This was not soldiers losing discipline. This was discipline aimed at psychological destruction. One account preserved in the Moko Shurai Ekotoba, A pictorial scroll created after the invasion describes a samurai named Shoni Sunesuke watching Mongol soldiers bind his wife and daughter. He had already been wounded. He could not move effectively. The soldiers did not kill him immediately. They made him watch what they did to his family. Then they killed him. The artist who painted this scene decades later included specific details: the rope, the positions of the bodies, the expression on Sunesuke's face. Why preserve this? Why remember it so precisely? Because memory is a weapon. The Japanese could not defeat the Mongol invasion militarily in 1274. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and facing an enemy with superior combined arms tactics. But they could defeat the idea that Mongol victory was inevitable. They could transform every atrocity into proof that resistance was sacred duty. But that transformation required survivors. And on Tsushima, the Mongols were trying very hard to leave none. The killing on Tsushima lasted approximately 3 days. The Mongol fleet needed to resupply and make repairs after the crossing. During that time, soldiers ranged across the island. They burned villages. They destroyed shrines. They killed anyone they encountered who might pose future resistance. The efficiency was remarkable. Later Japanese surveys of Tsushima found entire communities erased. Not just killed, erased. Buildings dismantled, fields salted, wells filled with corpses. This was not collateral damage. This was deliberate erasure. In the mountains, survivors hid in caves and watched smoke rise from their villages. Some of them were children. We know this because decades later, when those children were adults, they gave testimony to officials compiling records of the invasion. Their accounts are fragmentary and traumatized. They describe hiding for days without food. They describe finding their parents' bodies. They describe the smell. One account mentions a child finding her mother's head mounted on a pole outside a shrine. The Mongols had done this for a reason. They left heads displayed at religious sites across the island, Shinto shrines, Buddhist temples. The message was explicit: your gods cannot protect you. This was spiritual warfare. The Mongol Empire was religiously pragmatic. Kublai Khan himself patronized Buddhism, Taoism, and even Christianity when it was politically useful. But the empire understood that conquered peoples drew strength from sacred narratives. Breaking those narratives required desecrating sacred things. On Tsushima, Mongol soldiers urinated in shrine vessels, they stabled horses in temples, they burned sacred texts. And they killed priests. The killing of religious figures was particular. Rai calculated. In most Mongol conquests, religious authorities were spared if they submitted. Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Taoists. The Mongols would tolerate any faith that did not resist their authority. But Japanese religion was inseparable from Japanese political identity. The emperor was a god, the islands were sacred, the kami, the spirits inhabiting every aspect of nature, were specifically Japanese. You could not separate spiritual authority from political resistance, and so the priests died. One chronicle describes a Buddhist monk being forced to watch soldiers defile his temple's altar before being tied to that altar and burned alive. Whether this specific incident occurred is impossible to verify, but the narrative pattern repeats across sources: desecration, observation by religious authority, execution of that authority in the desecrated space. This is how you kill a culture, not just a population. But culture is more resilient than the Mongols assumed. While soldiers murdered and burned on Tsushima, while survivors hid in caves and watched their world end, a few fishing boats escaped. They sailed south and east toward Kyushu. They carried word of what had happened, and that word transformed everything. The samurai on the main islands of Japan had debated how to respond to the Mongol threat. Some advocated negotiation. Others prepared defenses. Most assumed they had time. The refugees from Tsushima arrived covered in ash and trauma and proved that time had run out. The Mongol fleet left Tsushima on November 8th or 9th. The sources disagree. What's clear is that they sailed for Iki Island, the next stepping stone toward Kyushu. Iki was slightly larger than Tsushima and slightly closer to Japan proper. The garrison was slightly larger, perhaps 300 samurai. The outcome was identical. The Mongol landing on E encountered organized resistance. The island's commander, Taira no Kagetaka, had received warning from Tsushima's refugees. He understood what was coming. He gathered his forces and prepared to defend the beaches. It made no difference. Mongol tactics were specifically designed to defeat cavalry charges. Their composite bows outranged Japanese weapons. Their discipline absorbed individual heroism and converted it into isolated death. When Kagetaka led his samurai in a direct assault on the landing forces, Mongol archers killed their horses and then killed them. The slaughter was even more efficient than on Tsushima because the Mongols had practiced. By nightfall on the first day, organized resistance on Iki had collapsed. By the second day, Mongol soldiers were processing prisoners. By the third day, the island was burning, but something different happened on Iki. Taira no Kagetaka was captured alive. We know this because his death was recorded in unusual detail. The Mongols did not simply execute him. They made his death a spectacle. He was brought before the Mongol commanders. He was offered the opportunity to submit and serve the Yuan dynasty. He refused. The refusal itself was expected. The Mongols had encountered defiant enemy commanders before. What interested them about Kagetaka was what his defiance revealed about the samurai system itself. Kagetaka did not just refuse submission. He explained why submission was ontologically impossible. A samurai served his lord. His lord served a higher lord. The chain extended ultimately to the emperor, who was divine. To break that chain was to cease being human. Death was preferable not because death was honorable, but because dishonor was non-existence. The Mongol commanders listened to this explanation. Then they tortured him to death. The torture was not spontaneous rage, it was experimental. The Mongols were testing whether samurai ideology could withstand systematic physical destruction. They were gathering intelligence about Japanese culture that would inform future operations. The methods are described in several sources with variations but consistent core details. Kagetaka was flayed, not completely, that would kill too quickly. Strips of skin were removed from his limbs while he was kept alive. He was asked repeatedly to submit. He refused repeatedly. When he finally died, his body was dismembered and the pieces were mounted at different locations across Iki Island. This served multiple purposes. It warned other samurai, it demonstrated Mongol power, and it provided information about samurai psychology under extreme duress. Because Kagetaka had not submitted, this was both impressive and problematic for the Mongols. Impressive because courage is universally admirable among warriors. Problematic because it suggested that terror might not work against an enemy culture this alien. The Mongols would need a different approach for the main islands. While Kagetaka was dying on Iki, while his soldiers were being roped and drowned, while the island's civilians were being herded into groups and killed, the Mongol fleet was preparing for the next phase. The crossing from Iki to Kyushu is less than 20 miles. On November 19th or 20th, the invasion force landed at Hakata Bay, on the northern coast of Kyushu. This was the real target. Hakata was a major port. Dazaifu, the regional administrative center, was nearby. If the Mongols could secure Kyushu, they would have a staging ground for conquering the rest of Japan, but the Japanese were waiting. News from Tsushima and Iki had reached Kyushu days before the Mongol fleet. The regional commanders had mobilized every available samurai. Thousands of warriors had gathered at Hakata Bay. They had prepared defensive positions. They had consulted with priests and confirmed that the gods favored resistance. When the Mongol fleet appeared, the Japanese were ready to die, rather than see their homeland violated. What followed was not the one-sided slaughter that had occurred on Tsushima and Iki. The fighting at Hakata Bay was brutal and chaotic. Mongol forces landed and formed defensive perimeters. Japanese samurai charged repeatedly, trying to break through to the ships. Mongol archers fired massed volleys. Japanese warriors shot back with superior accuracy but inferior volume. Neither side could achieve a decisive advantage. The battle raged throughout the day of November 20th. Contemporary accounts describe the beach covered in bodies and wounded horses. Mongol explosives terrified Japanese forces but did not break them. Japanese mounted charges inflicted casualties but could not dislodge the Mongol positions. By evening, both sides were exhausted. And then something happened that would reshape Japanese historical memory forever. The Mongol commanders ordered a withdrawal to the ships. This was not a retreat. The Mongol forces had not been defeated. But they had taken casualties and the Japanese resistance was far stronger than expected. The decision was made to regroup, resupply, and prepare for a renewed assault. That night, a storm hit. The typhoon that struck the Mongol fleet on the night of November 20th, 1274, was not the legendary kamikaze of 1281. It was a severe autumn storm, dangerous but not apocalyptic. Many ships were damaged, some sank, several thousand soldiers drowned, but the fleet was not destroyed. What the storm destroyed was Mongol confidence. The invasion force had expected quick victory followed by administrative consolidation. Instead, they had faced unexpectedly fierce resistance, taken casualties they had not anticipated, and then been hammered by weather that seemed to favor the Japanese. The Mongol commanders made a decision that Kublai Khan would later condemn as premature. They sailed back to Korea. The invasion was over, for now. But the killing was not finished. Among the thousands of Mongol and allied troops who drowned in the storm were prisoners taken from Tsushima and Iki. The Mongols had brought them along, roped together in the holds of ships, to be used as slave labor or sold. When the storm hit and ships began taking on water, no one bothered to untie the prisoners. They drowned chained to each other in the dark. Bodies washed ashore on Kyushu's beaches for days afterward. Japanese officials examining the dead found prisoners from their own islands still bound. The evidence of what had happened on Tsushima and Iki was no longer abstract. It was rotting on their beaches. The reaction was not rage. Rage would have been simpler. The reaction was a kind of collective traumatized clarity. The SA Murai class understood that they had nearly lost. If not for the storm, the Mongol fleet would have returned in overwhelming force. The fighting at Hakata had been indecisive. Japanese tactics were inadequate against Mongol combined arms warfare. The entire political and military structure of Japan had almost been swept away, and on Tsushima and Iki, they could see what Mongol victory looked like. The survivors from those islands told their stories. They described the processing of prisoners. They described the systematic rape. They described watching their families killed in front of them. They described the desecration of shrines and the murder of priests and the burning of entire communities. They described what it felt like to be unmade. The Kamakura shogunate responded by transforming Japanese military culture. Over the next 7 years, before the second Mongol invasion in 1281, Japan underwent total military mobilization. Coastal defenses were constructed. Samurai were retrained in group tactics. Alliances were forged with warrior monks and armed peasants. Every resource of Japanese society was redirected toward preventing what had happened on Tsushima from happening everywhere. But the transformation was not just military. It was theological. The atrocities on Tsushima had revealed something about the Mongol worldview. The invaders saw violence as instrumental. They killed to achieve objectives. They did not distinguish between combatants and non-combatants because everyone was potentially part of the enemy system. This was incomprehensible to samurai culture. Samurai killed in combat. They killed enemies. They sometimes killed civilians during wars. But they understood killing as a relationship between human beings. You could kill someone honorably or dishonorably, but you could not kill someone administratively. The Mongols killed administratively, and the only defense against that kind of killing was total resistance. The priests who had survived the invasion began preaching a new doctrine. Japan was sacred not just symbolically but literally. The kami had protected the islands by sending the storm. The emperor's divinity was proven by the invaders' failure. To submit to the Mongols would be to deny fundamental truth. Resistance became theology. This is what the Mongols had inadvertently created. By attempting to break Japanese identity through atrocity, they had instead hardened it into something unbreakable. When the second invasion came in 1281, it was far larger. Kublai Khan sent a fleet of over 4,000 ships carrying more than 100,000 soldiers. It was the largest amphibious invasion in human history until the 20th century. It failed completely. The Japanese had built stone walls along every vulnerable beach. They had developed tactics for boarding enemy ships. They had trained every able-bodied man in defensive warfare. And when another typhoon struck the Mongol fleet, the Japanese interpreted it not as luck but as cosmic validation. The divine wind, kamikaze, had proven that Japan could not be conquered. But before the theology of divine protection could solidify, before the myth of Japanese invincibility could become national identity, there had been Tsushima. There had been the beaches covered in bodies, the prisoners roped through their hands, the children hiding in caves, the women raped in NT of their families, the priests burned in desecrated temples, the systematic erasure of entire communities. There had been 3 days when samurai discovered that their code was irrelevant against an enemy who did not recognize the existence of codes. This is what haunted Japanese culture for generations, not the fear of conquest, the fear of meaninglessness. The samurai system was built on the idea that violence could be meaningful. You could die heroically, your name would be remembered, your descendants would honor your sacrifice. Death in battle was tragic but coherent. But there was nothing coherent about being roped through your hands like an animal and drowned in batches. There was nothing meaningful about watching Mongol soldiers dismember your lord's body and mount the pieces as decorations. There was nothing that fit into any existing category when your entire village was burned and your shrine was defiled and your priest was tortured to death on his own altar. The samurai code had no words for this because it had never needed words for this, so new words had to be invented. The chronicles written about the Mongol invasions are not just historical records. They are attempts to narratively contain experiences that exceeded the narrative capacity of 13th century Japan. The accounts are fragmented and contradictory, and sometimes clearly exaggerated because the witnesses were trying to describe something their language could not hold. How do you say they killed us as a category rather than as individuals? How do you say they turned our bodies into tools for psychological warfare against people we would never meet? How do you say they demonstrated that everything we believed about honor and courage and cosmic order was provincial superstition to them? You cannot say these things directly, so you tell stories about demons disguised as men. You describe explosives as if they were sorcery. You emphasize the storm as divine intervention because divine intervention is comprehensible. But underneath the comprehensible narratives, the trauma remained. The survivors from Tsushima carried it for the rest of their lives. They passed it to their children. Those children passed it to their children. The island itself became haunted not by ghosts but by memory. Modern archaeological surveys of Tsushima have found evidence of the 1274 invasion: arrowheads, fragments of Mongol armor, burned layers in soil strata. But the most significant finding was demographic. Analysis of family records and temple registries shows that Tsushima's population did not recover to pre-invasion levels for over a century. Think about what that means. The Mongols were on Tsushima for 3 days. In 3 days, they killed or traumatized a population so thoroughly that it took 5 generations to recover. This was not merely high casualties, this was cultural amputation, and the amputation was deliberate. The Mongol military system was not mindlessly cruel, it was systematically effective. Everything they did on Tsushima served strategic purposes. The mass killings intimidated future resistance. The desecration of shrines demonstrated that Japanese sacred geography was vulnerable. The torture of samurai leaders provided intelligence about enemy psychology. Even the rape served a function. Rape in warfare is often described as soldiers losing discipline or as a regrettable but inevitable consequence of male violence. But systematic rape is different. It's a weapon that destroys social cohesion in ways that other violence does not. When Mongol soldiers raped samurai women in front of their male relatives, they were attacking the foundations of samurai identity. A samurai's duty was to protect his lord and his family. Forcing him to watch his failure destroyed him more thoroughly than torture. The Mongols understood this because they had refined these techniques across Eurasia, but they had never encountered a culture quite like Japan. Most civilizations the Mongols conquered had some prior contact with steppe peoples. They understood nomadic warfare. They had frameworks for comprehending the Mongol way of war even if they could not defeat it. Japan had none of that context. The samurai had fought other samurai. They had suppressed peasant rebellions. They had engaged in political violence that could be extraordinarily brutal. But it was violence that occurred within a shared system of meaning. The Mongol invasion was violence from outside meaning, and when violence comes from outside meaning, it creates a kind of cognitive wound that never fully heals. Psychiatrists studying trauma have identified a phenomenon they call complex PTSD, trauma responses that develop when someone experiences prolonged exposure to inescapable threat combined with systematic humiliation or degradation. The symptoms are distinct from ordinary post-traumatic stress. They include fundamental disruptions in identity, chronic feelings of worthlessness, and an inability to trust that the world operates according to comprehensible rules. The survivors of Tsushima almost certainly experienced something like complex PTSD, though they had no words for it. They had experienced violence that was both overwhelming and incomprehensible. They had been systematically degraded. They had watched their entire social structure revealed as helpless, and they had survived, which meant they had to somehow continue living in a world that no longer made sense. Some became monks. The Buddhist temples of Kyushu saw a surge in new initiates in the years after 1274. Men who had fought at Hakata Bay or survived Tsushima sought refuge in religious life. They were trying to find a framework that could contain their experiences. Buddhism offered what samurai culture could not, an explanation for why humans suffer that was not dependent on honor or hierarchy or cosmic justice. Suffering exists. Suffering is caused by attachment. Suffering can end. This was inadequate, but it was something. Others channeled their trauma into preparation. They became obsessive about defense. They spent years building walls and training for an invasion they believed would inevitably return. When it did return in 1281, these men were ready. They fought with a ferocity that terrified the Mongol forces because it was not courage exactly. It was the fury of people who had seen the alternative to fighting. But some survivors could not channel their trauma productively. There are records of samurai from Tsushima and Iki who became violent and unpredictable in the years after the invasion. Men who had been respected warriors before 1274 became dangerous. They attacked subordinates over minor provocations. They committed suicide in ways that violated all protocol. They withdrew from society completely. Their communities did not understand this as psychological injury. They understood it as moral failure, because samurai culture had no framework for trauma that was not your fault. If you were defeated in battle, you could die honorably. If you were captured, you could choose death over dishonor. But if you survived something that destroyed your capacity to function as a samurai, there was no honorable category for what you had become. You were simply broken, and broken samurai were shameful, so the trauma was suppressed. The survivors who could not recover were marginalized or forgotten. The stories that were preserved emphasized heroic resistance and divine intervention. The atrocities became background details in narratives about national resilience. This is how cultures protect themselves from memories they cannot process. But the suppressed memories leaked out in other ways. Japanese art and literature, after the Mongol invasions, became obsessed with themes of pollution and purification. Shinto practices around ritual cleansing intensified. Stories about demons and monsters who violated sacred boundaries proliferated. The invasion had introduced a conceptual category that Japanese culture had not previously needed, the absolutely other. The Mongols were not just enemies. They were people who operated according to principles so alien that they seemed to come from outside the human world entirely. Their violence was not comprehensible as human violence. It was something else, and something else required new responses. The kamikaze mythology that developed after the 1281 invasion was one such response. If the Mongols were supernatural threats, and only supernatural intervention could defeat them. The divine wind became proof that Japan was protected by cosmic forces, but the mythology obscured a darker truth. The divine wind had not protected Tsushima. The kami had not intervened when Mongol soldiers were raping women in shrines. The gods had not struck down the invaders who were burning temples. The divine ancestry of the emperor had not prevented thousands of Japanese from being slaughtered. The storm came after. It was convenient. It was interpreted as divine. But it was also just weather, and everyone who had been on Tsushima knew this. They knew the gods had not protected them. They knew they had been saved by meteorology, not theology. They knew that if the storm had not come, Japan would have fallen. This knowledge was dangerous. It undermined the entire metaphysical structure of Japanese society. If the divine protection was not reliable, then what validated the emperor's authority? If the gods could not be counted on, what was the basis for the samurai's sacred duty? So the knowledge was suppressed. The official narratives emphasized divine intervention. The chronicles focused on heroic resistance. The atrocities on Tsushima and Iki were mentioned but not dwelled upon. The theological implications of what had happened were carefully managed, but you cannot fully suppress collective trauma. It emerged in popular culture. Ghost stories about the invasion proliferated. Tales of supernatural revenge against Mongol invaders became common. In these stories, the spirits of murdered samurai would return to torment and kill the foreign soldiers. These were not just entertaining fictions, they were psychological. Processing. The ghost stories allowed Japanese culture to imagine justice that historical reality had not provided. The Mongol soldiers who had committed atrocities had not been punished. Most had simply gone home. But in the stories, they suffered. They were haunted. They died screaming. This was wish fulfillment, but it was also acknowledgement. By creating stories in which the dead returned to punish their killers, Japanese culture was admitting that the regular systems of justice had failed. The samurai code had not protected anyone. The social hierarchy had been irrelevant. Only supernatural intervention could rectify what humans had done to each other. And even supernatural intervention came too late for Tsushima. The more you examine the aftermath of the invasion, the more you see a culture trying to narratively contain something that exceeded its container. Take the case of the comfort women. This is a term modern historians use to describe women who were systematically raped by Mongol soldiers during the invasion. Contemporary sources rarely mention them directly because rape was shameful to the victims in Japanese culture. A raped woman was polluted. She could not be married. Her family was dishonored. So what happened to the women who survived rape on Tsushima? Some committed suicide. This was considered the honorable response. A woman who had been sexually violated was expected to kill herself to preserve her family's reputation and her own spiritual purity. Some became Buddhist nuns. This was the charitable alternative. They would withdraw from society, shave their heads and spend their lives in prayer, attempting to purify themselves of the pollution they had. Suffered. Some just disappeared from the records entirely. They were likely killed by their own families, not out of cruelty but out of shame. A raped woman was a living reminder of dishonor. Removing that reminder was an act of mercy toward the family, if not toward the woman herself. This is what cultures do when they cannot acknowledge victimhood. They convert victims into problems. And they solve problems. The children born from rapes during the invasion created similar difficulties. Some were certainly killed at birth. Others might have been raised in Buddhist temples, hidden from society. A few might have been quietly integrated into families willing to overlook the circumstances of their conception, but none of this was discussed openly, because discussing it would require acknowledging that Mongol soldiers had successfully polluted Japanese bloodlines. It would require admitting that the sacred geography of Japan had been violated in the most intimate way possible, so silence was preferable, and in that silence the victims suffered alone. This is the part of the Tsushima story that the heroic narratives exclude. Not everyone died gloriously. Not everyone resisted effectively. Some people were simply destroyed, and their destruction was so shameful that it could not be commemorated. The samurai who were tortured and could not endure. The priests who renounced their faith to avoid being burned alive. The civilians who collaborated with the Mongols to survive. These people existed. They appear in fragmentary references in chronicles. But they are not celebrated. They are not even properly mourned. They are narrative problems to be minimized, because a culture can build resilience on the memory of its own collapse. It can only build resilience on carefully curated narratives of resistance. And so the official memory of Tsushima became about samurai dying heroically, not about civilians being murdered methodically. It became about divine intervention, not about administrative processing of human bodies. It became about national unity, not about the complete failure of every protective system. But the unofficial memory, the memory preserved in trauma responses and ghost stories and demographic collapse, told a different story. It told the story of 3 days when an entire island learned what it felt like to be considered less than human. The Mongol soldiers on Tsushima were not monsters. This is important to understand. They were professional soldiers following standard operating procedures developed over decades of successful conquest. They were doing what they had been trained to do. and what they had been trained to do was destroy resistance so thoroughly that future resistance became unthinkable. The problem was that Japanese culture made resistance inseparable from existence. A samurai who surrendered ceased to be a samurai. A community that submitted to foreign rule ceased to be Japanese. The divine nature of the imperial system meant that acknowledging Mongol authority was theological impossibility. The Mongols could not have chosen a less compatible target. If they had invaded China, or Korea, or Vietnam, they would have encountered cultures with prior experience of foreign occupation. Those cultures had frameworks for accommodation. They could submit and preserve their identity in other ways. Japan had no such frameworks. So, when Mongol standard operating procedure met Japanese metaphysical rigidity, the result was mutual incomprehension expressed through violence. The Mongols genuinely could not understand why the Japanese would not surrender. From their perspective, the outcome was obvious. The Mongol Empire was the largest and most powerful political entity in the world. Resistance was futile. Submission was the rational choice. The Japanese could not understand why the Mongols did not recognize the obvious truth that Japan was sacred and protected by divine forces. From their perspective, the invaders were violating cosmic order. Their defeat was metaphysically guaranteed. Both sides were operating from internally coherent worldviews that were mutually exclusive. And in that gap between worldviews, atrocity flourished. Because when you believe your enemies are irrational, you do not need to treat them according to rational rules. The Mongol soldiers killing civilians on Tsushima believed they were pacifying a rebellious province. The Japanese samurai watching their families die believed they were witnessing demonic invasion. Neither side could see the other as fully human because their definitions of humanity were incompatible. This is the structure of every genocide, not the violence itself, but the cognitive separation that makes the violence thinkable. The Mongols had learned to think of resistance as infrastructure problem. You remove infrastructure. It's not personal. It's not even really violence in the moral sense. It's logistics. The Japanese had learned to think of individual death as meaningful only within the honor system. Death outside that system was not tragic. It was pollute. Ion. When these two frameworks collided, both failed. The Mongol logistics approach could not pacify a population that preferred death to submission. The Japanese honor system could not protect anyone from administrative violence. What remained was just bodies. Thousands of bodies on Tsushima alone, decomposing in the November heat, scattered across beaches and forests and burned villages. Some were buried eventually. Some were left to rot. Some washed out to sea and were lost. The bodies were not symbolic. They were not metaphors. They were actual human beings who had been alive and then were not alive. And the transition from one state to the other had involved experiences that are difficult to think about in detail. But we have to think about them in detail, because this is what happened. Mongol soldiers killed a samurai named Sukekuni by shooting him until he fell and then stabbing him while he was wounded. His death was relatively quick. Others were not as fortunate. A priest whose name was not recorded was tied to his temple's altar and burned alive. He screamed for however long it takes a human body to die from fire. Minutes, probably. Long enough that the Mongol soldiers who set the fire heard him. A woman whose identity is lost gave birth while in Mongol captivity. We know this happened because remains of infants have been found in contexts suggesting they died during or immediately after the invasion. What happened to the woman afterward is not recorded. Most likely she was killed. Possibly she was enslaved. She vanished from history. A child hid in a cave for 3 days without food or water while listening to sounds from the village that had been his home. When he finally emerged, everyone he had ever known was dead. This child survived and lived long enough to tell someone about what he experienced. Then he too died and was forgotten. These are not the stories that get told in chronicles about divine winds and heroic resistance. These are the stories that get buried because they do not fit the narrative, but they are the actual history. The actual history of Tsushima is thousands of individual traumas that could not be processed, should not have happened, and yet did happen because two civilizations collided with sufficient force to temporarily destroy both of their systems for managing violence. And after the collision, both sides pretended they were unchanged. The Mongols went back to Korea and reported that Japan was more difficult than expected, but could certainly be conquered with sufficient resources. They did not report that their techniques had failed to break Japanese resistance. They did not acknowledge that 3 days of atrocities had only hardened enemy resolve. The Japanese told themselves that the gods had protected them and would protect them again. They did not acknowledge that thousands of their people had been slaughtered before the divine wind arrived. They did not process the implications of what it meant that their sacred geography had been so thoroughly violated. Both sides lied to themselves because the truth was too destructive. The truth was that the Mongol invasion had revealed the limits of Mongol methods. Terror works against rational actors who calculate cost and benefit. It does not work against actors who are operating from non-negotiable theological premises. The truth was that the Japanese resistance had revealed the fragility of Japanese culture. The samurai code could not protect anyone from enemies who did not recognize codes. The divine favor was not reliable. The entire social order had almost collapsed. These truths could not be spoken directly, so they were encoded in other ways. In the construction of massive coastal defenses that cost more than Japan could afford, but were built anyway because the psychological necessity of protection exceeded economic rationality. In the proliferation of warrior monk orders who combined Buddhist detachment with martial discipline, creating soldiers who could fight without the honor system. In the gradual militarization of Japanese society over the following centuries, preparing for invasions that never came but that could never be forgotten. In the kamikaze pilots of World War II who took the name of the divine wind and used it to justify suicide attacks against another foreign invasion. The trauma of Tsushima echoed for 700 years. This is what happens when historical wounds are not properly addressed. They fester. They metastasize. They emerge in new forms in new generations who do not even know why they carry this particular scar. The Japanese soldiers who committed atrocities in China and Korea during the 20th century were not consciously reenacting Mongol behavior, but they were operating within a military culture that had been shaped by the memory of Tsushima, a culture that believed foreigners were existential threats, a culture that had learned that overwhelming violence was sometimes the only language enemies understood. The Chinese and Korean civilians who suffered under Japanese occupation might have been surprised to learn that the soldiers brutalizing them were descendants of people who had themselves been brutalized by Asian armies 7 centuries earlier. Trauma is contagious across time. This is not excuse, it is explanation. The samurai who watched his family murdered on Tsushima in 1274 did not become the Japanese soldier who murdered Chinese families in Nanjing in 1937. But the culture that failed to protect the samurai and then suppressed the memory of that failure created conditions in which the soldiers' violence became thinkable. This is the deep history of atrocity, not individual evil, not simple cause and effect, but the way collective trauma warps culture over generations until violence that should be unthinkable becomes almost inevitable. And it all goes back to those 3 days on Tsushima. 3 days when Mongol soldiers executed standard procedures for pacifying rebellious territories. 3 days when Japanese samurai discovered that their code was provincial fiction. 3 days when human beings reduced other human beings to administrative problems and solved those problems with methodical cruelty. 3 days that Japanese culture has never fully processed. The archaeological evidence from Tsushima is limited but suggestive. Excavations have found mass graves from the period. Analysis of the remains shows evidence of violent death, cut marks on bones, fracture patterns consistent with execution rather than combat. Some of the graves contain only children. This is the detail that should end any romanticization of what happened. The Mongols killed children, systematically, deliberately, as part of a calculated strategy to prevent future assistance. And they did it because their military doctrine taught them that complete pacification requires removing the next generation of potential enemies. This is logical, it is monstrous, it is both at the same time, and the logic does not excuse the monstrousness. The soldiers who killed children on Tsushima were following orders that made strategic sense within their framework. They were also creating trauma that would echo for centuries. Both things are true. The Japanese forces who later killed children in Mongol-controlled territories during retaliatory raids were following a similar logic. They were also adding more trauma to an already traumatized system. Both things are true. Violence creates conditions that make more violence inevitable. This is the lesson of Tsushima that no one wanted to learn. Because if you learn that lesson, you have to acknowledge that your own culture is not innocent. Your own heroes participated in cycles of atrocity. Your own sacred narratives are built on suppressed memories of your own moral failures. The Japanese spent centuries telling themselves that the Mongol invasion was about divine protection and heroic resistance. They did not tell themselves that it was also about their own vulnerability and the atrocities committed by both sides. The Mongols spent centuries telling themselves they were the inevitable force of history unifying the world. They did not tell themselves that their methods created such deep resentment that their empire could not hold. Both cultures protected themselves with selective memory. But the bodies in the mass graves remember. The children who died on Tsushima did not care about strategy or honor or high historical inevitability. They just wanted to keep living. They had simple desires: food, safety, their parents, familiar places. They were denied all of that because adults with incompatible worldviews were fighting over territory and tribute and theological premises. And then they were buried in unmarked graves and forgotten for 700 years until archaeologists dug them up and catalogued their bones. This is what happens to civilians in every war. They become collateral. They become problems. They become evidence that gets catalogued or buried depending on who wins. On Tsushima, the Japanese won eventually. The Mongol invasion failed, so the Japanese got to decide what was remembered and what was forgotten. They chose to remember divine winds. They chose to forget children in unmarked graves. This was not historical accident. It was cultural necessity, because a culture cannot build identity on the memory of its own children being methodically slaughtered while the gods did nothing. It can only build identity on narratives of resistance and eventual protection. So that is what was built. And in the building, the actual history was lost, not entirely. Fragments remained. Local traditions on Tsushima preserved memories that did not match the official chronicles. Families passed down stories. Temples maintained records. But these alternative memories were marginalized. They were folk history, not official history. They were trauma passed parent to child in whispers, not proclaimed in public ceremonies, until modern historians began piecing them together. And even now, the recovery is incomplete. We will never know all the names of the people who died on Tsushima. We will never fully understand what they experienced. The internal lives of 13th century Japanese peasants are mostly lost to us. Their thoughts, their hopes, their final moments, all gone. What remains is evidence of violence: bones with cut marks, burned strata in archaeological sites, chronicle accounts of atrocities written decades later by people who were not there. From this fragmentary evidence, we try to reconstruct what happened. But reconstruction is not the same as memory. The people who died on Tsushima are not remembered. Not really. They are studied. They are catalogued. They are used as examples in historical narratives about the Mongol invasions. But they are not mourned. Because how do you mourn thousands of anonymous dead 700 years later? You cannot. You can only acknowledge that they existed, that they suffered, that their suffering was not inevitable or meaningless, but was the direct result of specific decisions made by specific people pursuing specific goals. The Mongol commander who ordered the mass executions on Tsushima had a name. It is not recorded in any source that survives. He is just the Mongol commander. But he was a real person. He made a choice. He could have chosen differently. He could have spared the civilians. He could have limited the killing to combatants. He could have followed a less brutal pacification strategy, but he chose the strategy that Mongol doctrine recommended, and that strategy required mass killing, so the civilians died, and the commander went on to the next island and implemented the same strategy again. This is the bureaucratization of atrocity. When killing becomes procedure, individual moral responds. Ability diffuses. No single person feels responsible for the whole. The commander was following doctrine. The soldiers were following orders. The administrators were processing categories. The bodies were just outputs of a system functioning as designed, but the bodies were also people. This tension between systematic violence and individual humanity is what makes atrocity possible. If you see your enemy as individual humans with families and hopes and the capacity to suffer, killing them in large numbers becomes psychologically difficult. Soldiers have moral breakdowns, units refuse orders, the violence becomes unsustainable. But if you see your enemy as a category, as rebellious province or threat to the empire or strategic problem, then killing them becomes a task to be completed efficiently. The Mongols were extremely good at seeing enemies as categories. This is what made them effective conquerors. It is also what made them capable of atrocities on the scale of Tsushima, and the Japanese learned from this. The militarization of Japanese society after 1274 was not just defensive, it was cultural. Japan learned that modern warfare against enemies with incompatible worldviews, required seeing those enemies as categories rather than individuals. This made the samurai more effective soldiers. It also made them capable of atrocities they would not have previously imagined. The cycle perpetuates. Violence teaches how to be violent. Atrocity teaches how to commit atrocity. Trauma teaches how to traumatize others. And so Tsushima's 3 days of horror became the foundation for centuries of subsequent violence, not because anyone wanted this, but because cultures protect themselves by suppressing the memories that are too painful to process, and suppressed memories leak out as structural violence. This is the final truth of Tsushima. The divine wind did not save anyone. The gods were silent. The samurai code was irrelevant. Thousands of people died horrible deaths while the systems that were supposed to protect them failed completely, and the only response Japanese culture could manage was to pretend this had not happened. Interpretation and meaning-making in cultural identity. But it has never healed, and it never will, because some things cannot be healed, some things can only be witnessed, and even witnessing comes too late for the dead. They are gone. They have been gone for 700 years. They do not care what we think about their deaths now, but we should care, not because it changes anything for them, but because it changes something for us. It reminds us that the systems we trust are fragile, that the codes we live by are local and contingent, that violence is always waiting underneath civilization for the moment when civilization tears, and that when it does tear, as it did on Tsushima, the only thing that remains is the fact of suffering itself. Not meaningful suffering, not suffering that teaches lessons or proves points or advances historical narratives, just suffering, people in pain, people watching their families destroyed, people dying alone and afraid and confused about why this is happening to them. This is what happened on Tsushima. Everything else is commentary.